Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone on the webinar to share some thoughts today with us about electronic cigarettes. So today's talk will start with some knowledge that we have learned over years about electronic cigarette, and then we'll talk about the knowledge gaps currently in the literature, and then share some of my thoughts about the biggest challenge that I see related to electronic cigarette, the unknown unknowns. So electronic cigarette, they're very different from traditional tobacco cigarette. They are battery-powered delivery system that allow nicotine vapor to be vaporized and then condensed into aerosol. And that can carry all sorts of different ingredients. The main ingredients in something called e-liquid, including propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. Those are FDA grade food ingredients. But once they get aerosolized into tiny particles and inhaled into human lungs, then the health effect is largely unknown. And inside the e-liquid, there's also nicotine levels, different levels, and different large variety of flavorings that people can add to the e-liquid. And over the years, E-cig device has gone through many generations, starting from the first generation, which looks very much like a tobacco cigarette, all the way to the fourth generation, which looks like a USB drive now. And what makes those generations devices unique and different in a sense is even though they look very differently, but then the fundamental mechanisms how the e-liquid are vaporized and generate e-cig aerosols are somewhat similar. It's all from heating coil that burns, heat it, and then allow the liquid to be vaporized and condensed into aerosol. So the vaping is becoming a public health concern, and you probably hear a lot in the recent news. And CDC recently introduced a term called EVALA to describe e-cig or vaping-associated lung injuries. And as of last month, there are 2,800 or so hospitalized cases of death that is related to EVALA. And many pollutants have been reported in e-cig aerosols, both in the mainstream and in the exhaled. And those including ultrafine particles, those are very tiny particles, size is less than 0.1 micrometer or 100 nanometer in size, and they can penetrate fairly deeply into our lungs. And fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, those are somewhat a larger size with aerodynamic diameter less than 2.5. And there's nicotine, different types of volatile organic compounds, lots of carbonyls, heavy metals, and also some TSMAs has been reported. So today's talk, I'm gonna walk you through from electronic cigarette emissions, what is happening in the mainstream, what device parameters and e-liquid parameters affect the aerosol coming out from e-cig, to what those when the e-cig aerosols get inhaled into human lungs and then exhaled, and how puffing topographies and inhalation exhalation parameters affect the characteristic of those exhaled e-cig aerosols. And then once the e-cig aerosol gets released into indoor environment, how does aerosol dynamics or room environment factors affect the transport and concentration and transformation of those aerosols. And then finally, when people are exposed to the mainstream or the secondary exposures, what are the health effects in terms of short-term exposures and long-term exposures? We know the long-term exposure is a major knowledge gap currently in the field. So let's start with mainstream e-cig aerosol emissions. As I mentioned, the e-cig device take on very different type of forms. Even within the same generation, this is like the pod type, you can still see there are many different designs. And the recent, the fourth generation Zhu device, they look very much like a jump drive, and that's actually make the adolescents very easy to hide and to use without being noticed, so cause lots of public health concerns. But as I mentioned, even though this device look different in their design parameters, but they all share something similar. There's a heating coil inside most of those devices and get heated. So the first study that we conducted is to try to figuring out when the e-cig devices, when the heating coil in the e-cig device get heated, what is the temperature profile look like? So here I'm showing you some data that we collected as a function of time. When the e-cig are puffed, then you see the temperature, heating coil temperature increase and then decrease. And they're following pretty much similar trends, even though there's some variabilities across different type of e-cig or different, even the same e-cig brand, but different units. Overall, we see that the peak temperature goes to somewhere around 160 degrees to 240 degrees. This is important information. So that's a fact, the chemistry that could potentially going on in the e-liquid. And then the heating coil temperature, we also found that increase if we have a longer puff duration, meaning each puff, if you go from 2 seconds to 5 seconds, then you'll like to see the temperature increases. This is not surprising. As you increase the puffing duration, you basically provide more power into the devices, allow the heating coil to be heated even more. And the flow rate going through the e-cig devices has a little bit negative effect on the heating coil temperature. So you're running more air through it, you're gonna likely decrease the peak heating coil temperature. On the e-liquid side, as I mentioned, the two major components is PG and VG, and they have very different types, characteristics in terms of flavor, vapor pressure, threshold throat heat, dehydration, and viscosity. And nicotine levels can go from 0 nicotine all the way to 36 milligrams, is equivalent to super high tobacco nicotine. And what makes e-cig unique is like the large variety of flavorings. There's almost everything you can think about. In candy stores, you'll find similar flavorings in the e-liquid. And this is actually one of the major issues that related to the electronic cigarettes, because I track some of the adolescents who might not originally start with tobacco cigarette, but perceive e-cig as no harm because they can have 0 nicotine and a cool thing to whip with all sorts of different flavorings. So FDA and are discussing, and there's actually some cities starts to ban the flavorings. I think California is also going through some flavoring ban in May. We're trying to do natural experiments before after to see if that affects any of the measurements that I'm going to show you later today. The e-liquid, because it has major PG-VG, and there are usually get mixed into different ratios, and so we have conducted a study to examine how the PG-VG ratios without nicotine, 0 nicotine, 2.4% nicotine, affect how the particle behavior coming out from the e-cig device. So we use DEHS, which is a non-volatile particle, as a benchmark and comparing different PG-VG ratio e-liquid. And you see there is difference, especially at higher PG-VG ratio, the nicotine starts to have some clear effects. So putting those information together, we know the device and e-liquid, they all affect what aerosol characteristic coming out from e-cig. Moving into the exhaled aerosols, puffing topography and the lung environment are very unique and affect e-cig aerosol as well. So this is a study that we did where we examined as the puffing duration increased, so when people puff from 2 seconds to 5 seconds, we see a very nice linear relationship in terms of the particle number concentration. That is a parameter to describe ultrafine particles. And not only does the particle number concentration increase as you puff longer, the size distribution, the aerosol particle size distribution also changed. The area under the curve, under those curves shows the total amount of particles. They increase as the puffing duration increased, but the mode of the particles also shifted to a larger size. So it's a very dynamic process. How you puff the e-cig, even the same e-cig can give you very different results in terms of dose and the size distribution of the aerosol coming out of it. And similarly, the puffing flow rate also has something similar effects. As the flow rate increase, the number concentration increase a little bit, and it also affects the size distributions. As the flow rate increase, the the mole diameters get smaller, smaller particles usually get deeper into the lung. So all of those put together affect the dosimetry, where the E-cig aerosol and in our respiratory system, and that is a very is a major knowledge gap in our current field. The lung environment is different from ambient environment, and most of the studies that have been published in the literature about E-cig aerosols are usually conducted in laboratory chambers, and those chambers are usually at room temperature and room relative humidity, but our lungs are actually at a very different humidity, 100%, and temperature 37 Celsius, our human body temperature. So then some study have conducted to show that E-cig aerosol particles tend to grow in human lung under high humidity because the aerosols can grow. They're hygroscopic. They likely to absorb water and grow in size as they travel down into the respiratory system. The DHC have some effects that affect the particle evaporation, and they can reduce the particle size. And another physiological parameter in the respiratory system can also affect the aerosol dynamics. Overall, there's just very limited information about how E-cig aerosols really deposit into which part of the respiratory system because they're unique characteristics. And right now, we're working with faculty in UCLA School of Medicine trying to develop an artificial lung system to better simulate the aerosol, E-cig aerosol deposition in the respiratory system. So moving into the indoor air quality impact, once the E-cig aerosol gets inhaled and then exhaled by a vapor into an indoor environment, there are many things that affect how they transport and translocate from one location to another location that involves many aerosol dynamics and also affected dramatically by the room environment. So this is a study where we measured E-cig aerosol particle levels. This is PM 2.5 mass concentration in the patient room when we bring in the E-cig user and let the user mimic some prescribed vaping protocols. And as you can see, and we measured the PM 2.5 levels at two distance from the user. As you can see, each specs showing here, those green specs, there are correlate to each vaping. So background levels is about 8 microgram per cubic meter. That's the room PM 2.5, relatively clean environment. And then when E-cig user starts to vape, the mean peak PM 2.5 concentration can go up to 1900 microgram per cubic meter. That's a very, very high levels. This is the level that is higher than the most polluted cities that you can ever imagine in the world. This is a extremely high level. And then the mean overall, the mean concentration is still around like 200 microgram per cubic meter. This is again a very high overall mean concentration. And moving a little bit further away, this is the green curve shows what we measured very close to the patient at 0.8 meter away. And when we move a little bit further away, we see the PM 2.5 levels dropped fairly quickly. And this is when just one subject sweeping in the clean room. And then this kind of like distance effects also perceives in terms of particle number concentration. We see there is 80% reduction just about a meter away from the source. And then this concentration drops fairly low to the background, almost to the background, 2 or 3 meters away. And similar effects I will observe for particle number and PM 2.5, both the ultrafine and fine particles. So not only does the E-cig aerosols have this spatial profile inside a room, what we found is those E-cig aerosols can also be transported from a vaping room to a nearby non-vaping room. This is a study we conducted in our laboratory where we have an E-cig user volunteer to vape in the vaping room as shown in this green dot here. And then we've also measured the particle levels in a nearby non-vaping room. So each study session has a background period and then a vaping period where you see the concentration starts to increase in the vaping room, and then a decay period where the concentration starts to decay. And the same thing happens for both cases, whether the only difference between A and B is the door between the two rooms are open in this, is open in this A panel and get closed in the B panel. So what you can see here is there's clearly, again, when the vaping is in session, the particle levels increase dramatically. And then once the vaping is over, the particle level starts to decay. And when the door is open between the two rooms, then the particles can transport into the non-vaping room. When the door gets closed, when the two rooms are segregated, then there's minimum amount of transport going on between the two rooms. So this is what we learned in the laboratory setting, and we want to see if that's something similar going on in the field. And this is a study that we conducted among vape shops. Vape shops is a business where people coming in to test all sorts of different E-cig devices and try out different e-liquid flavorings. And then sometimes they also use vape shop as a social gathering place and even do some trick and E-cig blowing competitions as we're seeing here in this picture. So we conducted a vape shop survey through a Yelp search. We found there's more than 3,000 vape shops in Southern California, and we went into randomly surveyed about 67 shops, and we found most of the shops, they have 1 to 5 employees working at a similar time. Mainly, most of them are having about 1 or 2. And then most of the employees work very long hours per shift. They usually work 10 to 12 hours. And they are generally young adults and very racially diverse population. And most of them are actually also E-cig users on their own. So they get both personal exposures and occupation exposures just because their job and also their personal choice on using E-cig. So there's based on those survey results, we found that majority of those vape shops are located in plaza settings, and they're usually small business, fairly small shop size. And even though some of them may have a ventilation, central ventilation in place, but most of them are really not on during the time, and lots of them just don't even have any ventilation to even start with. So there's clearly vape shop is a indoor space where E-cig are freely used, even though some of the public space already banned E-cig usage, but vape shop is still probably the only one public spaces where E-cig can be freely used and actually encouraged to use. So based on those survey results, we select 6 shops. Now we're actually moving into almost, I have done like dozen shops, but we're still processing the data at this point. Those 6 shops that we have studied so far, based on their locations and size and ventilation types, and we also measure the air exchange rate in each one of the shops. Air exchange rate, AER, is a measure to show how strong the air inside the vape shop get exchanged by the air outside the vape shop. So it's an indicator about how stuffy the air might be in the vape shops. And when we were doing the field work, our main focus is to measuring particle levels. We also quantify total vaping frequency. We call it TVF. It's basically how many puffs that our researchers observed per every 30 minutes in each of the shops. So as you can see, there is a quite range depending on the day and depending on the shop in terms of the total vaping frequency. So I want to start give you some overview about the levels of PM 2.5 that we measured across different shops. So today's data here are grouped based on the ventilation settings, whether the shop have no ventilation or have some window AC or have some natural ventilation where they just, you know, open doors most of the time. And then they have some central ventilation where they have central system to run the air through. So correspondingly, the air exchange rate increased from no ventilation all the way to central ventilation. And for each shop, we measured a busy day and then the last busy day. And as you can see, the busy day generally have a higher levels PM 2.5, and then there is an overall trend when the ventilation become poor, the particle levels become higher. And just to put the numbers into context, I'm labeling, this is the national ambient air quality levels that EPA regulate for outdoor air. This is what people report in hookah lounge and in smoking bars. As you can see, when the ventilation is poor in vape shops, the PM 2.5 levels are very comparable to the smoking bars and the hookah lounge. And they're way above the national ambient air quality levels. And the proximity effects in the vape shops are quite different from what we observe in laboratory settings. I think the reason here, what we're saying here is in different distance from the vaping area, vape shops usually have a designated vaping area, and then they have you know, social space and the storage space. So distance from the vaping area, we use that as a way to study the proximity effects. And as you can see, the PM 2.5 levels are not showing strong decay as our measurements are moving away from the vaping area. And that's very different from what we observe in the laboratory setting when we have one E-cig users to vape and following a well-defined protocol. And the reason that we think we're seeing this in vape shops in the real world settings is because there are lots of people vaping altogether. And then the ventilations in the vape shops are usually much, much lower. As we see the vape shop A here, those green bars have very low air exchange rate. So moving away from the vaping area does not necessarily reduce the PM 2.5 levels we measured in that particular vape shop. So in the you know, when we talk about electronic cigarette, people always want to ask, so how is that compared to tobacco cigarette? To answer that question, we reviewed the literature. This is a paper just accepted by the annual review public health, is available online, that we comparing the E-cig versus tobacco cigarette T-cig in terms of their impacts on indoor air quality. This slide is a little bit busy, but I'll walk you through that. A, we're talking about PM 2.5, B is particle number, PM 2.5 represents fine particles, and particle number is a good measure for ultrafine particles. And each panel we break into electronic cigarette on the top, and then tobacco cigarettes at the bottom. And then the color shows whether the data, the study was published for North America, green means Europe, and gray is other regions. So overall, as you can see, comparing PM 2.5, electronic cigarette data reported and tobacco cigarette data reported are very comparable. And there's some studies conducted on tobacco cigarettes outside of North America and Europe. Electronic cigarette works are mainly conducted in North America and Europe. And the particle number concentration have a little bit different stories. They are showing lower levels comparing to T-cigarette. And overall, there is also here. We're having our I guess the screen has a little bit of issue here, right? We continue. So bear with us because the screen, for some reason, is not a full screen show anymore. Okay, okay. Thank you, Christine. I'll figure out the troubleshooting. So then, the particle number concentrations, we're seeing a little bit less levels reported for electronic cigarette than the tobacco cigarette. And we also summarized the chemicals that we observed in e-cigarette versus tobacco cigarette. So this slide is busy, but let me walk you through. A shows what people reported in the mainstream coming out from tobacco cigarette and electronic cigarette, and B shows what reported from the secondhand aerosol that is in the electronic cigarette and tobacco cigarette. So the box with the plot is what we reviewed related to electronic cigarettes, and then the right bar shows the range that people reported for tobacco cigarette. So what we're comparing here is different groups of chemicals on the y-axis, and then what does the E-cig and T-cig differ in terms of the chemical profile for both the mainstream and the secondhand. So as you can see, the PGVG is something unique about electronic cigarettes. There's nothing comes out from tobacco cigarette, and then whether this is cause unique health effects is still a gap in current knowledge. And then the nicotine levels to tobacco cigarette, electronic cigarettes have comparable levels, even though the tobacco tends to have a little bit higher levels reported. Moving into the carbonyls, formaldehyde have comparable levels between tobacco cigarette and electronic cigarette. And then there are actually more levels, higher levels of some of the metals that has been reported in electronic cigarette than the tobacco cigarette. I think the same thing for iron. So overall, you can see there's a less pollutants in the electronic cigarette because there's no combustion process going on, but there are quite some chemicals that is observed in both, and some of them, especially PGVG nicotine and formaldehydes, and some of the metals are actually important pollutants in the electronic cigarette emissions. Similar profile is observed for secondhand, even though the overall levels are much lower, and there's also less data, less studies reported for secondhand aerosols from electronic cigarettes. So let's move into the last piece of information is the health effects. Once E-cig aerosols get exhaled into the indoor environment, if people are living with E-cig users, and then children, pregnant women, others will get exposed to secondhand exposures. And we're interested in knowing what is the health effects from those exposures. Well, first of all, the human study data are limited, but there are some in vitro and in vivo studies that has been published that linking electronic cigarettes to cytotoxicity, inflammatory response, oxidative stress, decreased cell variability, and there are some dose response functions published showing aldehydes and the loss of endothelial barrier functions. They're all reported on cell studies. Similarly, in animal studies, there has been studies reporting impaired lung functions with inflammation, immune abnormality, and then how that will affect underlying mechanisms. There's also some studies using animal models to study the cardiovascular effects and some respiratory and cardiovascular effects, and even some limited studies on looking at the carcinogens and neurologic toxicities. So while the human data are limited, there are quite a bit of evidence in the literature on health effects related to e-cigarette in vitro and in vivo studies. So I want to share with you some of the in vitro studies that we have conducted so far. This is in collaboration with Dr. Xia's group at UCLA Nano Institute, where we expose different type of cells using different type of acids to e-cig aerosols at different dose levels and different nicotine levels. So what we're measuring here, we're seeing the self-death and oxidative stress are showing some clear dose response functions. As the dose increases, we see the cell death and then the oxidative stress are showing responses. And the nicotine effects is not as clear as the dose of puffs from e-cig, and that's still something that we need to continue to study. And the panel D here basically shows put the data together into a heat map as a function of puff increase, as a function of nicotine increase. How does different cell acids give different responses? As you can see, again, there is a clear pattern related to the dose of e-cig exposures, and the effects of nicotine is not as clear. So moving into the in vivo study, we're again collaborating with Dr. Xia's group. We actually exposed transgenic animals. Those animals, once they get exposed, their lungs can be lit up, and then they can be the effect can be imaged while the animal is still alive. So we see E-cig can active inflammation pathways by comparing to negative controls and positive controls. Again, there is evidence showing dose response, 250 puffs versus 480 puffs, showing higher levels of those highlighted areas to E-cig response. And overall, the in vitro data and in vivo data that we have collected so far also support the hypothesis that E-cig aerosols are causing cell death and oxidative stress pathways that could potentially affect health effects. As I mentioned, the studies on human health are relatively limited, and some of the results are also mixed. Studies on respiratory health effects related to human, there's some evidence showing increased airway resistance, and there's some evidence showing respiratory effects, and then there's some suggestions about airway obstruction. Asthma attacks and chronic bronchitis also have been reported, especially among adolescents, but there's inconsistent results on whether lung function measures changes and inconsistent results on whether airway inflammation after short-term exposure changes. The study on cardiovascular effects are even more limited. Very limited studies have looked at heart rate variability and systemic oxidative stress and inflammation. And as I mentioned earlier, those are more or less short-term studies. The long-term study overall on human subjects are overall missing in the literature. So putting all the information together, we have learned a lot about electronic cigarettes over the years. The knowns, we know the E-cig device and e-liquid parameters, they all affect the aerosol coming out of the E-cig, and the puffing topographies and the how much airflow going through the E-cig devices also affect the aerosol characteristics. And we also know when the E-cig aerosol get released into environment, it degrades indoor air quality. Particle levels that we measured inside our lab, in the field, are very similar to what people reported for tobacco cigarettes. And what makes e-cigarettes aerosols very unique is they're very highly volatile. They are made of oil droplets and very dynamic. They decay quickly over distance when the vaping is at a relatively well-ventilated conditions. But when the vaping is occurring in not so well-ventilated conditions, such as a vape shop, then the e-cig aerosols actually persist for a longer period of time and persist at a higher levels in those confined environments. And we know the chemical compounds coming out from the e-cig aerosols, the majorities, the most important one, the substantive amounts is PGVG, nicotine, and as well as some of the toxic compounds such as formaldehyde and heavy metals. Those are the chemicals that we should focus on in our future study. The respiratory cardiovascular effects, there's some evidence has been reported mainly in animal and cell studies. Mixed results in human studies, even that is related to short-term exposures. The long-term exposures are missing. Through our research and literature review, we also identified many knowledge gaps. We call them known unknowns in this talk. The only commonality about those all-lung injuries is that we know the patients, they report use of vaping products. There's some evidence that pointing to THC and vitamin E acetal in the e-liquid, but nobody really knows whether those are the causative agents or they're markers for something else that is the patients get exposed to. So the causes are largely unknown, and we are actually trying to study that in our lab. And we also don't really know what contributing factors to the results observed in the in vitro and in vivo. We know there is in vitro in vivo response, but what is the contributing factors are still needs to be further studied. And as mentioned, the current human studies are mainly focusing on short-term acute effects, and results are sometimes inconsistent. And we don't know what causes the studies results to be inconsistent. Is the study design, exposure measurements, or endpoints, or just the cohorts are different? So there are lots of unknowns around the human study side. The symmetry of E-cig aerosols overall is just poorly understood because those aerosols are very different from classic solid sphere aerosols that people use to develop those long dosimetry deposition models. We don't know whether those E-cig aerosols will end once they get exhaled into the lung, because they're going to grow as they absorb water, and then that will change their deposition in the respiratory system. And how does that affect the subsequent health effects is largely unknown. And overall, just have the overall literature is very limited in terms of long-term human health effects. And that I know there's a few cohorts being funded by NHLBI and FDA to start to follow up cohorts for long-term. And hopefully that literature gap can be addressed in the future. So the biggest challenge that I see around E-cig aerosol research is those unknowns. Like, for example, we really don't know what the next generation of E-cig will look like. When we start to study electronic cigarette, we start with the first generation. At the time our first paper got published, E-cig devices already moved into the third generation. So in the research field, our researchers is always catching up with what the industry is moving. They're moving very fast and quick, and we're behind. And now we see Zhu. We were never imagining what Zhu would look like 5 years ago. Now we know it's the most popular device that adolescents use. We just don't know what the next generation E-cig will look like. And we also don't know what people will DIY to vape with in the future. And some of those eval that CDC reported starts to point to the black market e-liquid, where people just extract cannibal materials in extracts in their kitchen and add it into e-liquid. And those type of behaviors is very hard to model and very hard to systematically study in the research setting. So that's again a major unknown big challenge to study E-cig healthy fast. So with that, I'd like to thank many of my colleagues and students at UCLA who have collaborated with us over years, and they're contributing to a lot of the data that I'm sharing with you today, and our funding sources from TRDRP and HLBI and UCLA COEH have supported the studies that has been shared today. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'd leave some time for questions. If you're interested in some of the papers that is reviewed, summarized into this talk, the references are also available at the end of the slides. Thank you. Right, that's a very good question. That is related to like how epidemiology studies can be conducted related to those. And at this point, I think it's very hard because as we know, it related to the type of device people using, and also related to how they puff their device and what e-liquid they puff with. I think most for the most part, like in tobacco cigarette, they use pack ear as a matrix to measure exposures. Right now, I think people are generally just using how frequent you use your E-cigs. I think there is definitely room to improve in terms of like how we quantify exposures. So when we were in Vape Shops trying to quantify, we're trying to understand what parameters can predict the levels of E-cig aerosols we observed in vape shops. And we found the total vaping frequency is the best predictor that we have had so far. So this is basically how many puffs that we observe in vape shops per unit time. So maybe something can be thought about along that line to ask subjects like how many puffs that overall you puff per day. That may give a better sense, or maybe how many puffs you puff per hour, or something that will get us down to the per puff, the puff level will help to better assess the exposure. Thank you. That's a really good question.
So the next question we have is, in addition to lung and CBD effects in humans, are other effects on neurobrain function?
Yeah, that's also a very good question. Unfortunately, the study is very limited in the neurobrain function and mental health related to e-cigarette, and that's not surprising at this point because the field is still young. My background is in air pollution and health effects, and when we review the literature, if you're familiar with that, the literature about air pollution health effects also starts from respiratory and cardiovascular health, and eventually grow into looking at the neural and toxicity and mental health to some lesser extent. So I think this is clearly a direction, and that it should not be overlooked, should be studied, and this is of course into the known unknowns. We know there's potential effects, and they just need to be better studied. That's a very good question too. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? So since it doesn't seem we have any more questions, everyone quickly. Does anybody have any verbal questions? That's a heart. What color of a heart is it?
Red.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have any more questions, then I think we'll go ahead and close.
Could we write it?
Recording.
Write it.
We will
Could we write it? Could we write it?
and we will
We write it.
another question that came in.
Chimney.
All right.
Chimney.
The question is, what are the addiction issues for E-cigs? I hear a baby, but not.
Okay, let's go change Martina.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is related to addiction issues for E-cig. So the E-cig, for the most part, are not nicotine-free. While the e-liquid can be made nicotine-free, but when we survey vape shops, the most E-cig e-liquid gets sold out, it still contains nicotine. So the addiction comes from the nicotine side, not E-cig specific. So as long as people vaping electronic cigarette with e-liquid containing nicotine, then addiction issues is there. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so the next question is, how much nicotine do this device contains? So I think we actually have a slide where we can show you. The nicotine level covers a very wide range. The nicotine levels cover a wide range. As I said, the e-liquid can be 0 nicotine, but can also go up to 36 milligram. And this is comparable to super high nicotine levels in tobacco cigarette. And you can go all across the book. You have high level 16 and all the way to 36. So the nicotine levels can be customized to a wide range. And there's actually some inconclusive evidence where people may with even more nicotine just because the way the nicotine get delivered are different between electronic cigarette and tobacco cigarette. For people to get, for a smoker to get enough nicotine hit, sometimes they may need to vape in more electronic cigarette than tobacco cigarette. But the levels could be a very wide range as this selections. Well, thank you. If there's no more questions, I want to thank Christina for organizing this webinar. She spent lots of time preparing. And sorry about still technical glitches, but hopefully this talk could give you some sense about where things are, what we learned, what needs to be continued research, and what the big challenges are related to electronic cigarette. Thank you. Thank you.